Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and coming up, details on the world's top stories right now. First up, the headlines. Beijing says it firmly opposes military contact between the US and Taiwan after Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen confirmed the presence of US troops on the self-governing island to train with Taiwanese soldiers. Iran says it will resume talks with world powers in November on reviving a nuclear deal. This after a 5-month gap and in the face of mounting warnings that international patience is wearing thin. London urges Paris to de-escalate a row over post-Brexit fishing rights as France fines 2 British boats after checks. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi addresses the 18th ASEAN-India summit via video conferencing and says that mutual cooperation will strengthen ties during the difficult COVID period.
Well, Rome is all set to welcome the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi for the 16th G20 summit.
As the world's top 20 richest countries prepare to meet in Rome from October the 30th for a 2-day G20 summit, WION will have live reports with the focus this year on climate and COVID. Russia reports record numbers of daily coronavirus cases and deaths as Moscow shuts down non-essential services for 11 days to combat the surge of infections. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has addressed the 18th ASEAN-India summit virtually. He emphasised the importance of a resilient global value chain. Prime Minister Modi called for more digital cooperation, and he reiterated India's commitment to providing Quad-sponsored vaccines to Indo-Pacific nations. The Indian Prime Minister reaffirmed India's focus on a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific.
भारत के इंडो पैसिफिक ओशन इनिशिएटिव और आसियान के आउटलुक फॉर द इंडो पैसिफिक क्षेत्र में हमारे साझा विजन और आपसी सहयोग का ढांचा है.
Well, in a press briefing held after Prime Minister Modi's address, the Ministry of External Affairs said partnership with ASEAN is a key pillar of India's Act East policy.
Highlighting India-ASEAN cooperation in maritime domain, Prime Minister underscored the importance of strengthening convergence between India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative and ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific to ensure a free, open, inclusive and rules-based Indo-Pacific region. In this context, PM and ASEAN leaders welcomed the adoption of the joint statement in this regard as a means to enhance practical cooperation in the maritime domain between India and ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific.
The statement from the Indian Prime Minister comes amid growing Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region and what critics claim is an aggressive strategy. So an important summit. The East Asia meeting includes India, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the US and Russia. And next up, Rome is set to host the G20 summit on the 30th and 31st of October. The focus is on 3 key topics: climate, COVID-19 and building back better. It comes just before the United Nations COP26 climate change conference being held in Glasgow from the 31st of October to the 12th of November. Our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibal, who is in Rome for the summit, reports now.
Rome is decked up for a summit that will see the largest in-person gathering of world leaders amid the COVID pandemic. Leaders of 20 major economies will gather in the historic Italian capital for 2 days. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be representing India at the summit. This will be the 8th time Prime Minister Modi will be at the G20 summit since 2014. The first G20 summit he attended was the Brisbane summit in November of 2014.
The G20 summit takes place on 30 and 31st of October. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be participating in the summit, and this will be his third visit abroad amidst the COVID pandemic. He has already been to Bangladesh and United States. And G20, of course, provides a natural occasion for a number of bilaterals. From Rome, he leaves for Glasgow for the climate summit.
The Rome G20 meet will essentially lay ground for the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, in Glasgow, where the world will be discussing ways to lower emissions. The summit will also focus on a joint action plan on dealing with the COVID pandemic and its economic impact. But there will be a few notable absentees at the summit: Russian President Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Japan's new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and Mexican President Andrés López Obrador.
The Rome summit will be the 16th G20 summit that will take place over the weekend. Last year, the summit took place virtually amidst the COVID pandemic. New Delhi, of course, will be hosting the summit in the year 2023.
G20 was formed during the 2008 global economic crisis, with the first summit taking place in November 2008. The grouping has 20 of the biggest economies, accounting for a major portion of the global economy with 80% trade. 2/3 of population covering half of the world's land area.
The G20 summit emerged after the 1997 and 2008 financial crisis, and now taking a lead position when it comes to contemporary global political issues as well. Last year, amidst the COVID pandemic, it took strong actions, and of course earlier this month it held a meeting on Afghanistan. Amidst a dysfunctional United Nations, G20 is playing an important role, a decisive role, and it looks like it is the way forward. With video journalist Ajit Siddhansibal for WION in Rome, Italy.
Well, sticking with all this summitry, and ahead of hosting COP26, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is under pressure at home over the summit. He admits the talks, which start next week in Glasgow, could yet fail. So he's urging more countries to step forward with plans of action. The UK Prime Minister will host more than 120 leaders in Glasgow to try and reach agreements to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Shadow Business Secretary Ed Miliband has been using a Prime Minister's question session in the House of Commons to pile the pressure on Boris Johnson ahead of the summit.
We all need the vital COP26 summit in Glasgow to deliver next week, because failing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees will have devastating consequences for our planet, and that is shared across this House. Does the Prime Minister agree that to keep that goal of 1.5 degrees alive, we need to roughly halve global emissions in this decisive decade?
It is, of course, correct, Mr. Speaker, that COP26 is both unbelievably important for our planet, but also very difficult. And it's in the balance, Mr. Speaker. And he's right in what he says about the need to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and that will be, and it does depend on what happens this decade. It depends on the commitments that are made. All I will say, Mr. Speaker, is that already very substantial commitments under the UK presidency designate of COP have been achieved, and we've moved from only 30% of the global economy committed to a net zero by the middle of the century to now 80%. And every day as I talk to international leaders, we hear further commitments to make those solid commitments that the world will need. Whether it is enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is too early to say.
Very much an expectation management game going on there from Boris Johnson. Well, Ed Miliband slammed him for sending the wrong message ahead of COP26 by cutting Britain's aid budget. Financial assistance from richer countries to developing nations to fight climate change is one of the pivotal issues coming up in Glasgow. Ed Miliband urged the Prime Minister not to shift the goalposts during the COP26 conference.
Can I urge him, he mustn't shift the goalposts when it comes to Glasgow. It is about the emergency we face this decade. It's about the NDCs this decade. Please keep the focus on 2030, not 2050 and beyond.
Focus is certainly on 2030. We have 122 nationally determined contributions already. 17 out of 20 G20 countries have made NDCs, and the commitments are coming through. And he's right to say that we need to keep the pressure up. What you can't do, Mr. Speaker, is go in advance of what is truly practicable for the world economy and for what people can do. This government will go as fast as we possibly can.
Well, the UK heads into COP26 embroiled in a diplomatic row with Paris over post-Brexit fishing rights. France is threatening trade disruptions from next week if its boats are not granted more access to British waters. The measures targeting British fish exports would go into effect from November the 2nd. They include systematic customs and sanitary checks on products brought to France and a ban on landing seafood. Extra checks could also be extended to other merchandise too. London's Brexit Minister Lord Frost has called France's threats disappointing and disproportionate. He says they also do not appear to be compatible with the trade and cooperation agreement struck with the EU or with wider international law. London says that France will receive an appropriate and calibrated response. France has been angry, though, since some French boat licences were rejected by Britain and the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey. French maritime police have fined 2 British fishing vessels operating in the Bay of Seine. The UK's Interior Minister Priti Patel has called France's actions disappointing. She says Britain's met all its obligations under the trade deal.
Is this in response to the fishing trawler? So that is obviously a separate matter. But in terms of what has happened this morning, I think it's important to say, obviously, that it is disappointing, and we as a country have fulfilled all our obligations under the TCA. But at the same time, government and cross-government discussions will continue, both at Commission level but also with counterparts within the French administration.
It is just the latest in a series of disagreements that have pushed diplomatic relations between the two countries to their lowest point in decades. In June, furious French fishermen sailed to the main port on Jersey to protest. That prompted Britain to send 2 naval patrol boats to the area. Under the post-Brexit deal, EU fishermen wanting to operate in UK waters have to prove they've fished in the area in previous years. Rejected French fishermen say they are being unfairly treated due to bureaucracy. Iran has agreed to resume nuclear talks with world powers after a 5-month gap. The talks are expected to start before the end of November. Western nations hope the negotiations will help restrict Iran's nuclear program and prevent Tehran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran has stepped up uranium enrichment and is demanding the lifting of sanctions imposed by former US President Donald Trump. The move comes after Iran's foreign minister met with European Union mediators.
Regarding the talks that took place today in Brussels, after we have made our assessments with Dr. Bagheri tonight, we will decide on whether to announce the date of the start of talks with the 4+1 in Brussels, or perhaps we need more discussions after his return to Iran.
Iran has held 6 rounds of meetings with world leaders, including indirect talks with the Biden administration on returning to the 2015 deal. But talks paused in June as a new hardline government took office in Tehran. The US has urged the country to show good faith in the talks. Washington says it is willing to enter into an agreement only if Iran fully abides by the 2015 nuclear accord. The Biden administration also wants Iran to roll back its nuclear program. Iran says US sanctions must be lifted.
We're waiting for the United States to return to the agreement just in name. What matters is whether the result of a US return will benefit Iran and if it will move us towards the lifting of sanctions or whether it would create new limitations. I personally believe that if Mr. Biden is serious to return to the JCPOA, then he should show this so that we can believe that the Americans are actually serious about lifting sanctions.
The White House says the US will remain committed to diplomacy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone.
I know they've made similar comments over the last several days or week, I should say. Our commitment remains pursuing a diplomatic path forward. I would leave it to the negotiators to determine when the next round of discussions will be. Our framing continues to be compliance for compliance, and we'll leave it up to the Europeans and our negotiators to determine when the next step would be.
The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, is expected to travel to Iran. However, the date of the visit has not yet been confirmed.
As always, for me, pleasure. Very good to see
Sunao Tsorbi, the survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, has died at the age of 96. Suboi, who made opposing nuclear weapons the message of his life, met US President Barack Obama in 2016 when he visited Hiroshima. 20-year Suboi was on his way to college when he was caught in the blast.
Hiroshima atom bomb survivor Sunao Suboi, who became a prominent campaigner for nuclear disarmament, has died at the age of 96. Suboi met US President Barack Obama on his historic visit to the city. He smiled broadly as he shook Obama's hand. In 1945, when the first nuclear bomb attack was launched by the United States, turning the bustling metropolis into an inferno, Suboi was on his way to engineering school. He suffered such serious burns that a part of his ear was gone. At the age of 20, he picked up a small rock and wrote on the ground, "Suboi dies here," before losing consciousness. When he emerged from unconsciousness 40 days after the bombing, the war was over.
The nuclear accident has reawakened our deep-seated fears. This terrifies me from the depth of my heart. Life is more important than the economy and anything else on earth. It is precious, and this is a good time to reconsider the nuclear question. Everyone must think about it.
He later developed cancer and other diseases, but became a prominent advocate for atomic bomb survivors and a lifelong campaigner for a nuclear-free world.
People in Japan should do everything they can to avoid ingesting radioactive materials. People should take precautions and avoid drinking contaminated water, milk, and eating contaminated vegetables. The government says it's all right for 1 or 2 intakes, but for us, who were exposed to radiation, it's simply terrifying. We were contaminated from the inside, little by little over time.
Suboi died on the 24th of October in a hospital in Hiroshima in southwestern Japan. The cause of death was determined as an irregular heartbeat caused by anemia. There are 127,000 survivors of both attacks still alive, and their average age is 84. Around 140,000 people died in the bombing of Hiroshima, a toll that includes those who survived the explosion but died soon after from radiation exposure. A plutonium bomb dropped on the port city of Nagasaki killed about 74,000 people, leading to the end of World War II. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And finally, an Englishman has used the pandemic to build a colossal and minutely detailed railway model. The aim was to recreate his childhood memories, and the result is the UK's largest model railway. That is all for today's bulletin, which is now pulling into its final destination. Do stay on track with WION. Thanks for travelling with us.
During lockdown, I was down here 10 hours a day because it actually enabled me to really get cracking with it. I just wanted to recreate the place I used to go to as a child, being back in 1983 when Maggie was in number 10 and Duran Duran were in the charts. So it was just an eccentric way of reliving my past.